Hello, my dear friends. In the heart of Georgian London, thousands were quietly destroying themselves with a poison sold in every pharmacy, a medicine disguised as a miracle. Laudanum crept into bedrooms, nurseries, and parlours, consumed by the rich, the poor, women, men, and even infants. It dulled pain, blurred minds, and hollowed out bodies. Yet no one dared call it addiction. Families hid the bottles, doctors kept prescribing, and society looked the other way as a century of silence engulfed its victims. Tonight, step inside this hidden world and witness the life of a laudanum addict. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone in Georgian London felt unwell, whether it was a lady sitting in her drawing room or a man coming home from the workshop, there was one bottle that seemed to be in every house. It was laudanum. People thought of it as medicine, not as poison. The tiny glass bottles were sold openly in shops across the city. It was so common that even people who had little money could afford a small dose. Laudanum was a mixture of alcohol and opium. It dulled pain, eased sleep, and silenced children. It was a solution for everything, and that was why it became part of daily life. Among the wealthy, laudanum was considered elegant. A lady of status might keep a bottle near her bedside or in a small cabinet by the dining room. When she felt nervous, dizzy, or simply bored, she would take a spoonful. The doctors of the time often told women that laudanum was good for calming the nerves. The women themselves came to believe that life without it was too difficult. For them, the habit began as comfort. They might drink tea with friends in the afternoon and then excuse themselves to sip laudanum in private. No one thought badly of it. In fact, many thought it showed refinement. It is almost funny that what passed for elegance back then would today be compared to someone carrying a pocket full of painkillers everywhere they go. Workers also used laudanum. A man who spent all day lifting, hammering, or working by the river might come home with his muscles sore and his back in agony. He could not afford a long rest. He had to keep working the next day. Laudanum gave him temporary relief. He could drink a little before bed, sleep soundly, and wake up ready to force himself back to the same labour. For him, it was not about elegance or refinement. It was survival. Laudanum dulled the sharp pain and let him push through. The men who drank it did not call themselves addicts. They said they were just trying to keep their bodies moving long enough to feed their families. The use of laudanum did not stop with adults. Parents gave it to babies. A crying child was exhausting, and in homes where there were many children, constant crying meant no rest for anyone. Laudanum became a tool to silence infants. A few drops on the tongue could quiet a baby for hours. Bottles marketed directly for children even had soft names, suggesting comfort and safety. Some were called soothing syrups. They promised peace in a noisy house. The reality was that babies were being drugged to sleep. Some survived it, others did not. Small bodies could not handle what adults were pouring into them. Yet parents trusted what was sold to them, and no one stopped the trade. If we compare it to now, it would be like walking into a modern pharmacy and seeing bottles of morphine syrup sitting on the shelf next to cough drops. The acceptance of laudanum across classes is striking. In one street, a wealthy woman in silk drank it for her nerves. In the same street, a dock worker used it to ease his aching bones. In another home, a baby was given drops so the family could sleep. No one thought of it as dangerous. Instead, it was praised. Newspapers carried advertisements. Apothecaries displayed bottles in their windows. Laudanum was everywhere, in every circle, from the polished drawing rooms to the dim alleys. I cannot help but think that if I lived in that time, I too might have reached for it without questioning what it really was. This wide reach meant that laudanum was not hidden. People used it openly. Guests at a party might notice their hostess excusing herself to take a sip. A tired father might share with his friend that a few drops had helped him sleep despite his sore back. Mothers discussed how much they gave to their babies, comparing amounts like they were sharing recipes. The normalization of it erased any sense of caution. Addiction was not a word used in polite society. Weakness was the word they used. They believed some people simply had frail bodies that needed more rest. Laudanum, they thought, was a remedy, not a danger. The bottles themselves were easy to recognize. Dark glass, carefully sealed and labelled with elegant lettering. Some were small enough to fit in a pocket. Others stood tall on the shelves of a grand home. They were not treated as shameful objects. They were placed next to other medicines, like powders for stomach aches or syrups for coughs. A visitor opening a cabinet might see them and think nothing of it. They were part of ordinary life. The cost was another reason for its popularity. Laudanum was cheaper than hiring a doctor for repeated visits. For a working family, one bottle could last weeks and serve many purposes. For a wealthy household, it was part of the regular supplies, like tea or sugar. Everyone could reach it. Everyone could buy it. That kind of access meant that more and more people relied on it, until it became normal to assume that life could not be managed without it. The city itself carried signs of its presence. Apothecaries thrived. Some streets had multiple shops selling bottles to whoever asked. There were no restrictions on age or reason. A child could walk in and buy it if they had the money. Vendors saw no harm in selling it to anyone. It was business. The demand was high, and the supply kept growing. Georgian London learned to live with laudanum, not as a hidden vice but as a visible habit. Over time, habits turned into needs. A woman who started taking laudanum for sleepless nights might discover she could no longer face the day without it. A man who once took it only after hard labour might begin using it every evening. A baby given laudanum would grow up in a body shaped by it. This cycle spread through families and neighbourhoods, quietly but firmly. It was the start of a society where dependence was invisible because it was so widespread. What makes this story disturbing is not only the presence of laudanum but the acceptance of it. It was trusted, it was respected, it was used without hesitation. People in Georgian London believed they were managing their lives with the help of medicine. In reality, they were tying themselves to a bottle that would not let them go. The truth was that laudanum did not heal. It only covered pain, delayed discomfort, and created a deeper need. The image of a city where everyone, from the highest lady to the smallest child, shared the same bottle shows how fully laudanum had entered daily life. It crossed boundaries of wealth, class, and age. It did not discriminate. That universality is what made it both accepted and dangerous. People thought it was uniting them in relief, but in truth, it was binding them in quiet chains. As the story of laudanum continues, it becomes clear that what began as a harmless solution was setting the stage for something far darker, where relief turned into dependence and dependence turned into ruin. The story of laudanum in Georgian London cannot be told without explaining how it was first accepted as a cure for almost everything. People of that time did not look at the bottle with suspicion. They saw it as a trusted remedy, no different from how we might keep a jar of aspirin or a packet of cold medicine today. When a person walked into an apothecary, they did not need to give reasons or prescriptions. They could simply ask for laudanum, and they would receive it, measured out in neat glass bottles. For the sellers, it was business. For the buyers, it was health. The shelves of chemists were lined with bottles that promised relief from all sorts of discomforts, headaches, stomach cramps, sleeplessness, and even sadness could be treated with laudanum. Advertisements were printed in newspapers, calling it a safe and reliable answer. Physicians endorsed it freely. Some wrote notes suggesting a spoonful before bed. Others recommended it after meals. It was described as gentle, soothing, and effective. Families believed it was their shield against illness. Looking back, it is almost laughable that people trusted a liquid filled with opium as casually as if it were peppermint water. Women suffering from what doctors then called hysteria were encouraged to drink laudanum. Men who felt restless after long days were told the same. Children who would not sleep at night were given drops. There was no distinction between serious sickness and ordinary discomfort. Laudanum was presented as the cure for both. A person grieving a loss might be told to take it to soften their sorrow. A woman with menstrual pain would take it to relax her body. The boundaries between medicine and mood were blurred. The bottle was meant to fix it all. The strange comfort came from its flexibility. Laudanum could be used as a sedative, a painkiller, or even an emotional crutch. Because it contained both alcohol and opium, its effects were quick. A few drops made one drowsy, more drops silenced deeper pain, and larger doses placed the user into a heavy sleep. Doctors often wrote vague instructions such as take as needed. This open-ended guidance meant that patients decided for themselves how much to use. Over time, many increased the dose, not because they sought pleasure, but because the first effects no longer worked. What made laudanum different from other medicines was its reach. There was no clear group of people who avoided it. The rich used it to maintain calm. The poor used it to carry on with hard lives. Parents used it on children. Elders relied on it to ease the aches of age. In the medical world, no disease seemed too great or too small for laudanum. This general acceptance created an environment where dependency was invisible. If everyone used it, how could it be called a problem in our modern world? It would be as if strong narcotics were handed out like basic vitamins, accepted as ordinary and even expected. The market for laudanum grew steadily. Apothecaries found that customers returned quickly for more. They ordered larger supplies from manufacturers. The cycle was steady and profitable. The reputation of laudanum as a universal cure meant that few questioned its risks. Instead, its presence gave families a sense of security. To them, having a bottle on hand was proof that they were prepared for any illness. It was like keeping bread in the pantry or coal by the hearth. The thought of being without it was unsettling. This habit did not come only from ignorance. It came from trust in authority. When priests spoke of healing, when doctors wrote prescriptions, when newspapers published glowing accounts, ordinary people listened. They did not have the knowledge to question chemical contents or long-term consequences. They only knew that laudanum seemed to work, and that respected men said it was safe. I sometimes think that if I had been born in that period, I too would have trusted the words of doctors and reached for laudanum without hesitation. The lack of control was striking. No law limited its sale. No warning labels were placed on the bottles. The same substance that could knock a man unconscious for hours was sold with fewer restrictions than bread or ale. Children could fetch it for their parents. Servants could buy it for their masters. People spoke about it openly, without shame or secrecy. It was simply there, like candles or soap, a normal item in every home. The silence around its dangers was not born from fear, but from ignorance. Laudanum also became tied to identity. Some women were known for their delicate health, always needing a sip before bed. Some men were known for being able to drink more without appearing drunk. These small reputations became part of social life. People joked lightly about who needed more and who needed less. Behind the jokes was a hidden truth: their bodies were slowly being reshaped by constant use. They could not stop, yet they did not see themselves as weak. They saw themselves as simply managing life. The idea of laudanum as a cure-all did not fade quickly. It lasted across generations. Parents who had been given laudanum as children gave it to their children. The pattern repeated itself. It was not seen as an addiction, but as a tradition. In that repetition, dependence was passed down like an heirloom. Families carried bottles in trunks when they moved. Soldiers carried it when they travelled. It followed people through every stage of life, from birth to death. By the late Georgian period, the use of laudanum was woven into the very fabric of society. It was not only a drug, it was a habit of culture. The marble houses of the rich and the crowded rooms of the poor both held the same dark liquid. It shaped how people dealt with pain, sadness, and fatigue. It was medicine in their eyes, but poison in truth. The contradiction remained unseen. The reality was that laudanum's reputation as a cure for everything created a city that was quietly dependent. Even before the word dependence was widely used, people lived in its shadow without recognizing the danger. They thought they were healed, but in reality, they were bound. The idea that one liquid could answer every problem is what made laudanum both trusted and terrifying. What becomes clear next is how quickly this so-called cure slipped into daily routines, turning medicine into habit and habit into silent chains. Laudanum did not spread evenly across society by chance. Some groups relied on it far more heavily than others, and among the most visible were the women who sold their bodies on the streets and the artists who filled the city with music, poems, and stories. Both groups lived close to the edge of exhaustion. They turned to laudanum because it promised to take the edge off life. What they had in common was not wealth or privilege, but the constant pressure of survival, whether through the harshness of the body trade or the torment of creativity. The women who walked the streets at night faced lives that were often short and filled with pain. They had few choices. Work was scarce for poor women, and many ended up selling themselves because there was no other way to eat or to keep a roof overhead. The nights were cold, the encounters were rough, and violence was common. Their bodies carried bruises, illnesses, and fatigue. Laudanum became their shield. A few spoonfuls dulled the aches and blurred the memory of what they endured. It gave them distance from the reality of their work. Some women drank it before meeting a client, others after. But in either case, it became routine. It is grimly ironic that a drug sold as medicine became the daily armour of women whose society refused to protect. Artists turned to the same bottle, but for reasons that seemed more refined in the eyes of the public. Musicians, painters, and writers often spoke of laudanum as if it unlocked a door in their minds. They described how it helped them stay awake at night, following a thread of thought or melody. They claimed it soothed their nerves when inspiration would not come. They believed it removed barriers, allowing imagination to flow freely. In reality, the drug clouded their senses, making them drift between waking and sleeping states. Out of this fog, they sometimes pulled strange and vivid ideas that later appeared in their work. Audiences admired their brilliance without seeing the bottle that sat on their desks. If we looked at it from a modern perspective, it would be like discovering that half the most famous songs and novels of a city were written while their creators were sedated with narcotics. The two groups, prostitutes and artists, could not have seemed more different when passing each other in the streets. One group was seen as shameful, the other as admirable. Yet both clutched the same brown glass bottles. Both found relief in the same mixture of opium and alcohol. For the women, it was escape. For the artists, it was inspiration. Society condemned one and praised the other, but the effect of the drug was the same. Dependence grew silently in both worlds. I find it difficult not to feel that the judgment placed on these groups said more about class and reputation than about the drug itself. In taverns and hidden rooms, prostitutes sometimes drank laudanum together, sharing bottles like others might share bread. They laughed louder when the effect set in, or they grew quiet and heavy-eyed, leaning against walls until clients arrived. Their lives had little softness, and laudanum filled the gap. For them, there was no medical advice, no careful measure. They poured and drank until the pain faded. Some grew pale and thin quickly, their health sliding away. Others died young, their bodies already worn out before the drug claimed them fully. In candlelit studies, writers sat with quills in hand, dipping into laudanum when words would not come. They romanticized their habit. They spoke of visions, of heightened senses, of travelling to other realms of thought. Their letters and diaries sometimes revealed how deep the habit ran, though often cloaked in elegant words. the truth was less glamorous. They were caught in the same cycle as the women in the streets, taking more as the effect of the last dose wore off, chasing relief or a spark of energy that seemed harder to reach without the drug. The only difference was that when artists destroyed themselves with laudanum, society called it genius. The visibility of laudanum among these groups influenced others. Patrons of art saw respected figures using it and assumed it must be acceptable. Men visiting prostitutes sometimes noticed bottles on shelves or by the bed but thought nothing of it, as if it were soap or water. The normality spread, reinforcing the idea that laudanum was harmless or even useful. What was hidden was the damage, the bodies of women wasting away, the minds of artists unravelling, the dependence deepening with each drop. None of this appeared in the polished image society preferred to hold. The connection between creativity and laudanum became so strong that some young artists began using it deliberately, hoping it would make them more talented. They mistook the haze for brilliance. They copied the habits of their idols, not realizing they were stepping into the same trap. Meanwhile, prostitutes introduced new girls to laudanum as part of the routine, telling them it would make the nights easier to endure. The cycle renewed itself in both groups. Dependence passed like an unspoken lesson. The strange truth is that two groups at opposite ends of society, one celebrated and one despised, found themselves bound by the same quiet addiction. Laudanum became the hidden thread linking music, poetry, and art to the most desperate trade in the streets. It blurred class lines while reinforcing hypocrisy, for people admired the artist and condemned the prostitute, though both relied on the same drug. The belief that laudanum could inspire or protect only made the trap tighter, drawing in more lives with the promise of relief or brilliance. What comes next is how this widespread use began to leave marks on the body itself, changing the faces, the skin, and even the breath of those who could not put the bottle down. The presence of laudanum in the lives of women was not only widespread but also deeply hidden. On the surface, many of them carried themselves with the grace expected in Georgian London. They went out for walks in fine dresses. They greeted neighbours politely, and they arranged their hair and painted their faces before appearing in public. Behind this routine, their bodies and minds were tangled in a struggle that few could see. Laudanum had become part of their daily rhythm, but the signs of dependence were masked by silk and powder. In social gatherings, a woman might seem composed. She would sip tea, exchange remarks about the weather, and keep her posture straight. No one would suspect that only an hour earlier, she had taken laudanum to quiet her shaking hands or her restless heart. The drug gave her the strength to move through the day, but it also hollowed her out. When the effect wore off, anxiety returned. The cycle repeated again and again. It is strangely ironic that society admired these women for their elegance, when much of that appearance was held together by a bottle of opium and alcohol. The pressure on women to appear calm and dignified made laudanum even more attractive. Public life demanded composure, while private life often meant exhaustion. Many women were expected to manage households, raise children, and maintain social appearances all at once. When they felt faint, nervous, or sad, laudanum was recommended. Doctors even encouraged its use, calling it a gentle remedy for female troubles. It was prescribed for menstrual pain, sleeplessness, or what they vaguely called hysteria. The fact that it dulled emotion was seen as proof that it worked. No one considered the cost, but the cost was high. Over time, the constant use of laudanum disrupted the natural rhythm of the body. Heartbeats became irregular. Women complained of dizziness and trembling. Some miscarried, their pregnancies unable to survive the strain. Others found their cycles disrupted until they stopped altogether. Families whispered about weak constitutions, not realizing the real cause was the very medicine trusted to make women well. If we put it in modern terms, it would be like a society where doctors casually handed out strong opioids for every cramp or restless night, ignoring the long-term damage while insisting it was harmless. Women rarely spoke of these struggles openly. Silence was part of their role. To complain too much was to risk being labelled dramatic or unstable, so they endured quietly, taking laudanum behind closed doors, smiling in public while their bodies grew weaker. The secrecy did not mean shame. It meant survival. They believed they had no choice but to continue. Their lives were arranged around the bottle, from the moment they woke to the time they lay down at night. The calm expression on their faces hid a dependence that was consuming them. In the quiet hours of the morning, some women measured out drops before facing the day. At night, they took more to fall asleep. Servants noticed but said little. Husbands sometimes knew but looked the other way, as long as the household ran smoothly. Children grew up seeing their mothers pale and weary, not understanding the cause. What looked like fragility was in fact the mark of constant drugging. I cannot help but think that many of these women might have lived longer, healthier lives if they had been offered rest, kindness, or true medicine, instead of a bottle that only deepened their suffering. The cultural expectation of control over female emotion fed the cycle. A woman who showed anger or despair was judged harshly. Laudanum softened those feelings, turning visible distress into silence. In that sense, the drug served not only the women but also the society that preferred them subdued. Calm wives and mothers were easier to accept, even if the calm was manufactured. The reality was a generation of women living in muted tones, their emotions dulled and their health collapsing. The toll showed itself gradually: pale skin, tired eyes, trembling hands, and sudden fainting became common descriptions in letters and diaries. Friends might remark gently on how delicate a woman had become. Rarely did anyone connect this fragility to laudanum. Instead, it was attributed to the natural weakness of women. The drug was seen as a support, not the cause. This misunderstanding allowed dependence to deepen without challenge. Inside the privacy of their rooms, the struggle was harder to hide. Women sometimes increased their doses when the usual amount no longer eased the discomfort. They found themselves unable to function without it. The nervous energy that once drove them to social duties was replaced by sluggishness. Yet they continued, because to stop meant facing unbearable withdrawal. The habit bound them as tightly as any chain, though no one saw it that way. Some women suffered in silence until their deaths. They slipped away young, their bodies too frail to endure the strain. Families mourned without realizing that the medicine they trusted had hastened the end. Others lived longer but with constant ill health, drifting between states of numbness and agitation. These stories were rarely told openly. They remained in the background, hidden behind the walls of fine houses and respectable facades. The image of women walking in bright dresses while carrying the invisible weight of laudanum shows how dependence could exist quietly in plain sight. It was not a scandal, not a whispered sin, but an ordinary fact of life. Their beauty and dignity were preserved outwardly while their inner strength eroded. The reality that a trusted medicine quietly undermined the health of so many women makes the silence around it even more striking. What follows is how the children of these households, especially infants, were drawn into the same cycle, given drops of laudanum to quiet their cries before they could even speak. The story of laudanum in Georgian London would not be complete without looking at the way it touched the very youngest lives. Infants, who had no choice and no voice, were given drops of the same mixture that adults use to steady their nerves and dull their pain. Mothers, already tired from the demands of work, house duties, and sometimes their dependence on the drug, often turned to laudanum as an answer for sleepless nights filled with the cries of a baby. It was easy to reach for the bottle, and no one warned them of the danger. The practice became so common that entire products were designed around it. One of the most notorious was a syrup called Godfrey's Cordial. It was sold specifically for infants and children. Advertisements promised that it would soothe restlessness, stop crying, and bring peace to households. Apothecaries displayed it proudly, and parents bought it with relief. Inside the bottle, however, was laudanum mixed with other ingredients. The effect was strong enough to knock a baby into long hours of unnatural sleep. It is a dark kind of humour to realise that what was marketed as a soothing cordial was, in truth, a sedative powerful enough to silence even the most restless infant. In crowded homes, where many children lived together in small spaces, the sound of crying could wear down entire families. Mothers, desperate for a moment of quiet, reach for Godfrey's cordial or simply diluted laudanum to give to their babies. Servants sometimes administered it when parents were absent. Neighbours shared recipes for the right amount, as if it were nothing more serious than tea. Few understood that they were exposing tiny bodies to a substance that even adults struggled to manage. The babies often slept for hours, giving mothers the rest they needed, but the cost was hidden inside their fragile systems. Doctors of the time rarely raised concerns. They prescribed laudanum for infants as freely as they did for adults. If a child was sickly, restless, or had trouble digesting food, laudanum was suggested. They believed it calmed the body, not realizing that it was suppressing vital functions. As a result, entire generations of infants were exposed to the drug in their earliest months of life. For many, it became a repeated part of their daily care. If we compare it to today, it would be like putting bottles of morphine cough syrup in the baby aisle of a supermarket, complete with smiling labels and cheerful instructions. The consequences were severe. Some babies developed constant lethargy. They no longer cried as loudly, no longer responded with energy, and seemed weaker as weeks went by. Others suffered from digestive troubles or shallow breathing. A number of infants never woke up after being given too much. Death certificates often listed vague causes such as failure to thrive or sudden illness, hiding the role laudanum played. Families grieved without ever realizing that the medicine they trusted was the very thing that had taken their children. For the babies who survived, the effects could last into childhood. Some grew dependent, their small bodies adjusting to regular doses of laudanum. Others suffered developmental problems, their growth slowed by the sedative effect. The cries of infants had always been nature's way of demanding care, but laudanum muted those cries. The silence seemed like peace, but it was in truth a warning of harm. Parents mistook quietness for health, when it was instead the stillness of a drugged child. I cannot help but feel that this silence must have haunted some mothers later, when they realized that the peace they longed for had been bought at the cost of their child's strength. The availability of these products showed how far society had normalized laudanum. Bottles marketed for babies were placed alongside those for adults. There was no line between safe and unsafe, no distinction between ages. Families used it without thinking, as if it were a simple household remedy. The cycle of dependence began before a child could even walk or talk. The first tastes of laudanum entered their mouths before they could form memories, tying them to a substance that would shape their lives long before they understood what it was. Accounts from the time describe households where every member, from the grandmother to the youngest infant, consumed laudanum in some form. It was not shocking to anyone. It was normal. Mothers who had been given laudanum as children continued the practice with their babies. They passed the habit down as naturally as they passed down recipes or traditions. This unbroken chain ensured that laudanum remained not only a medicine but a family custom. The saddest part of this story is that the harm was preventable. But prevention required knowledge, and that knowledge did not exist. Families trusted what they were told. Apothecaries did not question their sales. Doctors did not research the consequences. In this silence, infants suffered the most. Their lives began with dependence, and in many cases ended with it. Society accepted their deaths as natural tragedies, never connecting them to the bottle in the cupboard. The image of mothers rocking babies to sleep after giving them laudanum shows how innocence and dependence were woven together from the start. The trust of parents, the helplessness of infants, and the careless freedom of apothecaries created a system where the youngest paid the highest price. The reality that an entire market was built around drugging children should unsettle us, even centuries later. What follows is how laudanum became not only a family habit, but also the structure of daily life, with people waking, eating, and sleeping according to the doses they consumed. The daily rhythm of a person dependent on laudanum always began with the same thought: how to take the first dose before the body collapsed. For many in Georgian London, the morning did not start with bread or porridge, nor with the bustle of servants preparing a meal. It began with the reach of a hand toward a dark bottle. The body, having endured the night in uneasy sleep, woke with tremors, sweats, and waves of anxiety. Before any work could be faced, before any conversation could be made, the dropper or spoon touched the lips. This was how the day was set in motion. The first sip was often mixed with tea. Some diluted the laudanum in hot water, hoping to soften its bitter taste. Others swallowed it straight, too desperate to care about flavour. Breakfast was not important, for food felt heavy in the stomach of a body already dulled. Many went without eating, finding that the drug was enough to carry them through the early hours. What mattered was avoiding the storm that came when the night's dose faded. If too much time passed, the shivering grew worse, and the body's cries became unbearable. Men and women alike learned to time their mornings around this ritual. Servants in wealthier houses sometimes poured the liquid before their masters even stirred, just as naturally as they would draw the curtains or light the fire. Workers in smaller homes kept bottles close to their bedsides, so they could drink before their feet touched the floor. The moment of waking was the most dangerous. Without laudanum, the body seized control, demanding more. The drug was no longer a choice. It was the key to standing up and moving at all. It is oddly comical to imagine that what some called their morning tonic was in truth the same thing that left them unable to rise from bed without it. After the first sip, calmness returned, though it was not the natural calm of a healthy person. It was a fragile balance, created by chemicals. The heart slowed, the hands stopped trembling, and the mind steadied. Many describe the sensation not as joy, but as the removal of fear. Normality itself became rare. It was not happiness they sought, but stability. A body without laudanum felt like a prison, while a body with it felt like a borrowed peace. In that strange exchange, the morning dose became sacred. Without it, nothing else could begin. Work and daily tasks were all scheduled according to the next dose. A man who had to leave for labour drank before walking out the door. A woman who needed to meet friends or manage her household drank before putting on her gown. Even children given laudanum by their mothers began their days this way, unknowingly shaped by routine dependence. The bottle was as central to mornings as the sun itself. Everyone in the household knew it, even if no one admitted it aloud. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like families keeping strong narcotics beside the sugar and tea, starting every day with chemicals instead of breakfast. Through the late morning, many felt an uneasy balance. The drug kept them steady enough to function, yet it dulled appetite, clouded thought, and slowed the body. People stumbled through chores or work, not with energy but with a heavy calm. Letters from the time describe women fainting suddenly in parlours, men drifting into half-sleep at workbenches, and children appearing far too quiet for their age. All of this was accepted as normal fragility or natural temperament. The truth was far more direct. The drug governed the pace of life. For those who were wealthier, the morning dose was often disguised with elegance. It might be poured from a polished bottle, measured with silver spoons, and spoken of in gentle terms. For the poor, it was swallowed quickly, often from chipped glass, with little ceremony. But in both settings, the dependence was identical. The city's social classes looked different on the outside, but laudanum erased many differences once the morning dose was taken. I often feel that the most haunting part of this history is how dependence looked refined in one home and desperate in another, yet in truth, it was the same weakness. As the hours passed, the need grew again. The body remembered the bottle and sent warnings in the form of headaches, shivers, or a restless stomach. Many people carried small containers when they left home, so they could sip during the day. Mothers tucked it into baskets, workers hid it in pockets, and even students brought it to lessons. The fear of being caught without laudanum was greater than the fear of being caught using it. Everyone who depended on it knew that a single missed dose could ruin the entire day. By midday, meals were often skipped, appetite was low, and food seemed less important than keeping balance with the drug. Some tried to eat, but nausea followed. Families noticed patterns but said little. They believed in delicate constitutions or sensitive nerves, not addiction. The language of medicine at the time had no words for what was happening. People thought they were caring for themselves when in truth they were binding themselves tighter with each sip. Children raised in these homes grew up watching mornings shaped by laudanum. They saw their parents or relatives begin the day with a dose, and they learned without being told that this was normal. Some were given drops themselves when restless, reinforcing the cycle from birth. The rhythm of a household became the rhythm of laudanum. Morning, midday, evening, and night were no longer measured by the clock alone but by the bottle. The idea of a normal morning without laudanum faded from memory. For the addicted, life before the drug no longer seemed real. They forgot what it felt like to wake with energy or to eat without nausea. The drug defined their sense of time, comfort, and survival. Every day repeated itself. The same beginning, the same needs. It was a cycle without exit. The image of mornings ruled not by sunlight or breakfast, but by the need for laudanum shows how deeply dependence reshaped the daily life of Georgian London. People started their days not with hope but with fear of what would happen without the drug. The reality that stability itself became a rare luxury explains why laudanum tightened its grip so quickly across every class and age. What follows is the description of how these bodies, bound to the morning dose, began to reveal visible changes in their faces, skin, and breath, turning dependence into a mark that others could see even from a distance. When the morning dose of laudanum was delayed or missed, the body of the addict began to turn against itself. What started as a slight unease quickly grew into waves of torment. The stomach twisted in sharp cramps that seemed to fold the body inward. The head pounded as if pressed by an unseen weight. The arms and legs shook without control. Each moment without the drug stretched into an ordeal that felt endless. This was not a sickness in the usual sense. It was the body's demand for the substance that had become its master. The bowels rebelled first. Cramping tightened the muscles until people doubled over, clutching their stomachs. Vomiting often followed, leaving them drained and pale. The head throbbed, heavy and dizzy. Sleep was impossible, and rest offered no comfort. Sweat poured down the skin even in cool rooms. Rashes and hives sometimes appeared, showing how the body was fighting itself. The shakes grew so strong that cups fell from hands and pens dropped from fingers. Families saw loved ones in these states and called them weak, not realizing that they were watching withdrawal. It is cruelly absurd that what they thought of as frailty or bad nerves was simply the natural reaction to being denied opium. The mind did not escape these torments. Anxiety swelled into panic. Small noises startled them. Thoughts raced in circles. Some wept openly, unable to stop. Others screamed into pillows or clawed at their skin. The craving for laudanum burned so strongly that nothing else mattered. All sense of dignity disappeared. People begged silently inside themselves for the bottle. The drug had reshaped their brains so deeply that absence felt like death itself approaching. Doctors at the time rarely recognized these symptoms as withdrawal. They described them as nervous conditions, fevers, or fits. Families accepted those words and nodded, even while seeing the pattern repeat whenever the drug was withheld. The idea that a respected medicine could enslave the body was beyond their imagination. Instead of removing the drug, they increased it, trying to soothe the visible pain. The result was a cycle that deepened year after year, as bodies learned to collapse more violently whenever laudanum was missing. The physical spectacle of withdrawal was impossible to ignore in shared homes. In small rooms, neighbours could hear the cries. Servants in wealthier houses noticed when their masters sweated through linens or thrashed at night. Yet silence was maintained. Respectability demanded that no one speak of such things beyond the household. The cries were treated as private suffering, not a public problem. If we think about it with modern eyes, it would be like entire neighbourhoods hearing the pain of addiction, but choosing to believe it was nothing more than an ordinary illness. Children saw their parents or relatives writhing and trembling. They grew used to the sight, though they did not understand it. Some thought that sickness was simply part of adulthood. Others learned to fetch bottles quickly, becoming unwilling assistants in the cycle. Their young minds formed early lessons about dependence, lessons that would follow them into their own lives. The pattern of addiction was passed down not only through blood but through daily example. The length of these withdrawal fits varied. Some lasted hours, others stretched for days if the drug remained unavailable. The longer it went, the worse the symptoms became. Convulsions shook bodies until exhaustion made them collapse. Sleep was restless, filled with jerks and cries. The body fought to rid itself of laudanum, but the mind refused to allow it. The conflict was relentless. Many gave in, returning to the drug simply to end the agony. Few had the strength or the support to endure it fully. For those who tried to resist, the risk was immense. Some died during withdrawal, their hearts giving out under the strain. Others suffered lasting damage, their nerves permanently shaken. The absence of medical understanding meant that families watched helplessly, unsure of what to do. The only relief seemed to come from the very substance that caused the suffering. To survive the fits, they had to drink again. In that paradox, the power of laudanum showed itself most clearly. I often feel that the saddest truth of this history is how people believe they were cursed with weakness, when in fact they were prisoners of a chemical trap no one had warned them about. Even in public places, signs of withdrawal appeared. Men at work dropped tools, trembling uncontrollably. Women fainted in markets, their skin drenched with sweat. Strangers helped them sit or lie down, assuming it was simple faintness. When the episode passed after another sip of laudanum, no one questioned the cause. The explanation was always fragility, delicate nerves, or exhaustion. The deeper truth remained invisible. The cycle hardened its grip over time. Each withdrawal fit convinced addicts that they could not live without the drug. They remembered the terror of those hours or days and vowed never to endure them again. Thus, they increased their daily doses, not for pleasure, but to avoid suffering. The memory of pain was enough to tie them forever to the bottle. Addiction did not require joy. It required fear, and laudanum provided both the escape and the punishment. The picture of bodies twisting in pain, sweating through sheets, and crying out for relief shows how withdrawal defined the private reality of laudanum addiction. These were not rare events, but common patterns repeated across countless homes. The fact that society explained such suffering away as weakness or nervous illness reveals how little they understood about what was truly happening. What becomes important next is how women, in particular, carried these torments quietly, expected to endure their fits without complaint, their silence becoming part of the hidden fabric of Georgian households. Once laudanum had been used long enough, the body no longer responded to the same small doses. In the beginning, a teaspoon was enough to calm nerves or stop pain. After days and weeks, the same amount felt weak. People believed their illnesses were worsening, so they swallowed more. They trusted the bottle without doubt. They did not see that the medicine itself had reshaped them. The drug no longer soothed, it commanded. The change from relief to dependence happened quietly. Someone who once mixed a few drops into tea began drinking it plain. Soon, a spoonful was not enough. Larger amounts became a daily habit. What once worked gently now required more and more. Families saw bottles empty faster, yet they explained it away as fragile health. It is almost amusing that people trusted laudanum more when it worked less, instead of asking why their bodies cried for greater amounts. Morning routines shifted first. People woke unsteady, shaking until they drank. Breakfast lost meaning. Instead of bread, they sipped laudanum. Workers carried flasks to jobs, pausing often. Women took it before grooming. Children given drops by mothers soon needed larger shares. The bottle became the centre of every morning. By noon, another dose was taken. By night, more still. The rhythm of life became the rhythm of the drug. The body weakened under this cycle. Skin turned pale, lips cracked, eyes dulled. Weight dropped as appetite disappeared. Constipation became constant. Stomachs twisted with cramps. Women lost their cycles. Men lost the strength to labour. Families saw a decline but called it a weakness of nature. Doctors agreed, prescribing still more. If we compare it to our time, it is like a doctor telling a patient to increase narcotics every week while calling the side effects proof of bad blood instead of addiction. Memory faltered as doses climbed. Thoughts slowed. Sentences broke apart. Parents repeated themselves to children. Workers dropped tools. Housewives forgot tasks. Servants covering mistakes. Decline of the mind was explained as aging or nerves. Few admitted that laudanum itself was the cause. Silence covered the truth. People lived in decline and called it normal. Wealthy homes masked the habit with polish. Bottles stood in cabinets, measured with silver spoons. Doctors reassured families that patients were sensitive but stable. Poor homes showed the raw truth. People drank from chipped cups, grimaced at the taste, and slumped in corners. Children watched without words. Both rich and poor were ruled by the same drug. I feel that laudanum erased class more effectively than any law, binding people of all ranks under the same invisible chain. Fear drove the climb. People remembered the misery of withdrawal. They recalled sweats, cramps, shaking, and dread. To avoid it, they drank more quickly and more often. Addiction no longer gave pleasure. It held back torment. The prison was locked not by joy but by fear. People stayed in the cycle because leaving meant pain greater than they could bear. Apothecaries profited. Bottles sold faster and in larger sizes. Customers returned often, sometimes daily. Doctors gave notes to justify every purchase. Families praised laudanum for keeping loved ones alive. No one asked why doses rose so high. No one questioned why lives grew smaller while bottles grew larger. The trade thrived in silence. The climb had no ceiling. Some people drank so much that their hearts failed suddenly. Death was explained as frailty, old age, or illness. Empty bottles nearby told the true story. Laudanum had hollowed them until nothing was left. Yet even in death, the drug was praised as comfort. Society refused to name the prison that had claimed so many. Survivors lived in shadows. They did not seek joy. They sought to stand, to walk, to keep breath steady. Each swallow was not a choice but a demand. Families accepted it as normal. Children grew up learning that every meal, every night, every trip began and ended with laudanum. Life bent around the bottle until nothing outside it mattered. Neighbours noticed the fading health of entire households. In some streets, 2 or 3 families all lived under the same fog, with children running errands to fetch bottles as if it were bread or milk. The habit passed quietly from parent to child, teaching the next generation dependence before they could name it. The prison required no guards. It stood in plain sight, bottles on shelves, spoons on tables, cups by bedsides. No bars were needed. The body enforced the sentence. Each larger dose was another lock. Each swallow proved escape impossible. People believed they were saving themselves. In truth, they were feeding the jailer who owned them. The city carried the evidence everywhere. markets filled with pale faces, workshops slowed under weak hands. Even churches saw their pews lined with men and women swaying under the weight of constant dosing. What was once a medicine for the sick had become the background rhythm of an entire society. The image of men and women taking ever larger amounts only to stay upright shows how the body had become a prisoner of laudanum. The search for comfort had turned into a battle for survival. The fact that laudanum was praised as a healer even while it forced endless doses makes its hold darker still. What comes next is the story of how even sleep, once seen as a refuge, was taken over by the same drug, turning nights into long, uneasy hours. Once laudanum had claimed the waking hours, it soon reached into the nights, where sleep was supposed to bring rest. For many who relied on it, nights no longer offered peace. The drug pushed them into long hours of drowsiness, but not into deep slumber. Their eyes closed, their bodies lay still, but their minds drifted in uneasy currents. They did not wake restored. They woke more tired, more heavy, more hollow. Sleep, once the final refuge of the weary, became another stage of captivity. At first, laudanum seemed to help with rest. People took it at night to ease pain and to soften nerves. The first nights felt calm, but soon the body adapted just as it had during the day. The doses increased. Instead of easing into gentle sleep, people collapsed into a stupor. Hours passed, but dreams turned uneasy, thoughts confused. They awoke with heads pounding, mouths dry, stomachs twisted. It is almost darkly funny that the same drug sold as a sleep aid left its users waking more exhausted than when they went to bed. Morning after morning, people described heavy limbs, throbbing temples, and restless minds. Instead of renewal, nights delivered punishment. Families noticed relatives who spent 12 hours in bed but still shuffled through the day, weak and dazed. The pattern repeated in households across London. Some thought they were cursed with fragile health. Others believed poor air or damp houses caused the fatigue. Few admitted that laudanum had stolen rest itself. The pattern worsened with time. The more people drank, the more shallow their sleep became. Their bodies twitched. Their breaths turned uneven. Some spoke nonsense in their dreams. Others rose from beds, wandering halls without memory. Servants whispered about masters walking with blank eyes, moving objects, muttering words, then returning to bed as if nothing had happened. These moments of sleepwalking frightened households, but no one connected them directly to the drug. The wealthy endured these nights in silence. Fine bedsheets hid restless limbs. Servants were told not to speak of strange behaviour. Doctors reassured families that nerves often disturbed sleep, that sensitivity explained the movements. Poor households endured more openly. Children woke to see parents wandering rooms or crying in half-sleep. Neighbours heard groans through thin walls. They all understood that something was wrong, but they lacked words to explain it. If we compare it to today, it would be like a patient taking heavy sleeping pills only to spend the night tossing, muttering, and rising confused, yet still being told by doctors that the medicine was safe. The mind did not rest. Dreams grew vivid, tangled, and disturbing. People spoke of seeing faces, hearing voices, or reliving memories. Some woke screaming, others woke crying without cause. By day, they felt dazed, unable to separate dreams from reality. Memory slipped further, and concentration weakened. Nights that should have healed only deepened confusion. Bodies carried the cost as well. Without deep sleep, muscles failed to recover, hands trembled more each day, eyes grew sunken, backs bent under constant fatigue. People aged quickly, appearing older than their years. Children noticed their parents fading, but they thought it was a way of life. In truth, laudanum had stolen the healing power of sleep and replaced it with hollow hours of stupor. Some users tried to cut back at night, hoping to rest naturally. They found it impossible. Without laudanum, Sleep refused to come. They tossed for hours, drenched in sweat, cramping in pain. At last, in desperation, they drank again. Relief came, but only in the same shallow stupor as before. The prison left no exit. Sleep itself depended on the drug, yet the drug ruined sleep. The cycle repeated in every class. Merchants woke with headaches, mothers woke with swollen eyes. Children raised in homes with constant dosing learned that nights meant moaning, wandering, and unease. The city itself felt it. Streets filled each morning with men and women walking as if half asleep. Markets bustled with sluggish movement. Workshops echoed with yawns and dropped tools. Even churches filled with drowsy faces, heads nodding through sermons. Laudanum had invaded the very rhythm of rest. Doctors kept describing the problem as a weakness of the constitution. They offered no cure but more medicine. Priests said poor sleep was a trial to be endured. Families spoke of their relatives as delicate. No one admitted that the drug designed to heal had become the thief of rest. The silence gave laudanum more power. It remained respected, even as it drained people night after night. I cannot help but feel that watching entire households sink into restless nights, while still praising laudanum, shows how denial can blind a society to its suffering. The evidence lay in pale faces and heavy steps, yet people refused to see it. Over time, the lack of true rest changed character itself. People grew irritable, impatient, and withdrawn. Small arguments erupted in homes. Workplaces grew tense. Communities lost warmth as tired minds and bodies struggled to cope. The absence of deep sleep hollowed not only the body but the spirit. Lives shrank, narrowed to the cycle of dosing and waking without peace. The picture of men and women taking laudanum at night only to wake more tired each morning shows how even sleep had been turned into another prison. The fact that laudanum remained praised as medicine while it destroyed the very purpose of rest makes its hold even more cruel. What follows is how families themselves began to unravel under the constant weight of addiction, as love and duty collided with dependence in the most private corners of the home. The decline of a laudanum addict's body was a slow destruction that no one could mistake once it had begun. Faces that once carried colour and life became pale, grey, and sunken. The eyes were no longer steady. They retreated into hollows, surrounded by shadows that even the heavy powders and rouges of Georgian society could not hide. A person who once filled out their clothing properly began to look as if the garments belonged to someone else. The fabric sagged, the shape diminished, and the figure grew frail. This was not a weakness that could be disguised at a ball or in a drawing room. It was written across every feature of the addict's appearance, and those around them noticed, even when they avoided saying so aloud. The digestive system was often the first to fail. Constipation of a kind that lasted for days left sufferers curled in bed, trapped in discomfort. Some tried to escape the pain by consuming even more laudanum, creating a cycle that deepened the damage. Others suffered the opposite violent, exhausting bouts of diarrhea that left them trembling and unable to move about with dignity. Both conditions brought shame and exhaustion. Meals became smaller, then skipped altogether. The presence of food on the table turned into a burden, with servants quietly carrying away untouched plates. It almost seems darkly amusing that a drug once praised as a soothing medicine could so quickly destroy the very appetite that kept people alive. The hands gave away the neck sign, nails cracked and split, often tearing painfully against cloth or paper. Fingers shook when holding a quill, spilling ink across the page. A raised glass trembled against the lips. Gloves became common among those who could afford them, but they covered little more than the broken nails, not the trembling beneath. Women suffered cruelly when their hair began to fall. Brushes filled with strands, and hairpieces became not just fashion but a necessity. Men, though often excused by age for thinning crowns, could not hide the lifeless tone of their skin or the dullness of their eyes. The body, once strong, betrayed its decline in ways that wigs and powders could never disguise. Strength left the body quickly. Rising from bed became a task that required determination. Walking across a room became exhausting. Once upright, legs shook and muscles gave way. Tasks that once filled the day, from running shops to writing letters or managing a household, fell away. The addict sat still for long hours, staring at the fire or out the window, unable to gather the energy to act. Time stretched without meaning, and entire days passed in silence. Women faced harsher judgment in this decline. Georgian society measured them by beauty, grace, and health. A pale face at a social gathering or a fainting spell during a carriage ride brought whispers. Families explained away their weakness as a natural delicacy, preferring to preserve appearances rather than confront the truth. It reminds me of how modern people also invent softer explanations for destructive habits, avoiding the truth in order to feel less uncomfortable. Men suffered too, but their humiliation appeared in the public sphere. Clerks lost their positions when their hands could not keep their writing steady. Merchants failed to balance their accounts. Labourers fell behind in their duties, unable to keep up with the pace of work. In taverns and clubs, men who once joined in laughter sat silently, their frail appearance marking them as outsiders. The family home showed the greatest burden of all. Children watched their parents fade before their eyes. A father too weak to lift his child, or a mother too exhausted to rise from bed, left scars that no polite excuse could cover. Servants bore witness as well. They carried basins, cleaned up after sickness, and watched their employers collapse into weakness. Silence surrounded these duties, for few dared to speak openly of what they saw. Portraits of the time tried to hide this truth. Painters softened the features of their subjects, adding colour to cheeks and fullness to faces. But behind closed doors, candlelight revealed what no portrait could disguise. A gaunt figure sat hunched in a chair, bones sharp beneath thin skin, hair dull, nails broken, hands twitching. In finely furnished homes, surrounded by polished wood and heavy drapery, Addict seemed out of place, fragile shadows in grand rooms. This collapse was not limited to the wealthy. In crowded working homes and damp tenements, the same signs appeared. The addict wasted away, unable to labour, unable to provide. The loss of wages brought hunger, and hunger hastened the decline. Laudanum did not distinguish between classes. It ruined the strong and the fragile alike, reducing both to weakness. Doctors often failed to see the truth. They prescribed more laudanum to treat the very symptoms it had caused. Families followed their advice, clinging to the hope that medicine would heal. In reality, each new dose pushed the addict deeper into collapse. They saw their bodies break piece by piece, hollowed eyes, brittle nails, thinning hair, shaking hands, and exhausted muscles. I cannot help but think how frightening it must have been to look into a mirror and recognize that the medicine you relied upon was the same force undoing your body. The decay of the body was relentless. It did not pause for wealth, reputation, or hope. It marked itself in the way a person walked, the way they looked, the way they failed to eat, and the way they sat in silence. Society continued to call it weakness or delicate health, avoiding the word addiction. But the evidence was there, in every trembling hand and every grey face. And if the wasting of the body could already be read in hollow cheeks and trembling hands, the very smell that clung to the addict would betray their suffering even more clearly. Among all the signs that marked a laudanum addict in Georgian London, none was more inescapable than the smell that followed them. It was not the scent of perfume or the aroma of food clinging to their clothing. It was something more unsettling, a mixture of alcohol, bitterness, and decay that no washing could erase. Laudanum was a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, and its odour did not disappear once swallowed. It seeped through the breath, through the pores of the skin, and into the very air around the addict. Families noticed it in shared rooms. Servants smelled it when they dressed their employers. Strangers caught it in the street. It was a constant presence, a reminder that addiction was never truly hidden. The breath of the addict carried the strongest clue. It was heavy with the sourness of alcohol and the bitterness of medicine. Conversations were difficult because the odour pushed people back, even when politeness demanded that they stand close. Husbands avoided their wives. Wives turned their faces from their husbands, and friends found excuses not to linger. It feels almost cruelly comic that the same society that drenched itself in powders, scented oils, and flowers had to endure conversations perfumed by the reek of a drug. No amount of cloves, mint leaves, or scented handkerchiefs could disguise it for long. It returned again and again, as permanent as the addiction itself. The skin of the addict betrayed another layer of this distinctive smell. Pallor was already obvious to the eye, but touch and closeness revealed clamminess. The skin was often cold and damp, a sheen of sweat forming even in cool weather. The odour of this sweat was different from that of ordinary exertion. It carried the sharp note of medicine and the sour trace of sickness. In crowded rooms, where Georgian society gathered for dinners or musical evenings, the addict stood apart even when dressed in fine clothing. Perfumed oils and powdered wigs could not mask the truth that the body itself was leaking the drug. Hands told their own story. They shook with weakness, but they also gave off the scent of dryness and neglect. Lips cracked and bled, leaving traces on cups and linens. The mouth itself was often dry, leaving addicts constantly licking their lips or sipping water in vain attempts at relief. This dryness produced its odour, a faintly sour note that blended with the bitter alcohol of laudanum. It reminds me of how in modern times